Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. And as we get sort of close to the end of the year, this will be my last little weekly wrap up for a week or two, just because we'll go straight into New Year's. I'll be talking about my top books of the year, all that kind of jazz. But this point of the year for me, normally in terms of my reading, at least for the last few years, is very much the kind of catch-up period of all the books that I've been sort of putting off all year that I really want to read. And particularly that's been sort of linked to in December, sort of reading sort of indie presses. So a few of those will show up in here, but there'll be a few others that I'm sort of squirreling away to read over the break as well. But anyway, let's get started with talking about some of those books. First up is Of Cattle and Men by Paula Maia and translated by Zoe Perry. And this, a very short book, about 100 pages long, is a really quite fascinating book in many ways. It really revolves around essentially a set of people working in an abattoir, and particularly following their lives as they kill various cows to provide meat. And the book really zeroes in on that experience of what it's like to be these sort of people having to work in quite horrifying conditions, in the sense that, you know, they're constantly covered in blood and they're constantly surrounded by various scenes of death or what have you. Really starting this video off on a positive note here. It's a book that I just thought was really quite startling for what it achieves here, because it takes this idea of this and sort of spins out more of a story about a kind of wider conversation about sort of almost a divorce from nature, because slowly as this story goes on, we start to see how nature is responding in kind of curious ways to what's going on. So, for example, cows who sort of suddenly want to start escaping and seem quite melancholy, and other animals who are sort of reacting kind of oddly as well. So sort of this very interesting and kind of brutal environment. Really interesting book. It's sort of, yeah, for a book that is so short, it really manages to achieve quite a lot in terms of the conversations it has around the sort of the effects of brutality on humans, as well as on animals. Next up, I read As the Eagle Flies by Nolwenn Blevennec, and translated by Madeleine Rogers. And this is really, again, sort of, indies do it better, I think. Indie presses often publish sort of the weird and wonderful, and I think this is sort of one of those. It's a book that largely looks at a woman who is starting to have an affair and the kind of early stages of it. But it's this really kind of interesting book in several ways. It sort of takes these little side alleys down sort of wider conversations around notions of what it means to be with one partner. It kind of delves into a lot of kind of quite humorous bits around the interactions between these people, and also the sort of central woman in this, her sort of almost her motivations for being with either man are quite bizarre and quite interesting in many ways. But it's this sort of really fun book in the sense of the narrative voice of this I found really quite compelling. There's a way in which our main character is both entirely acting on logic and reason, on others completely acting on emotion, and others this sort of absurd thing where we don't really know if we can trust her. So there's something just really quite interesting about it. And again, this is why I love indies, because this book kind of allows for this sort of short, focused narrative on something around, you know, the sort of story around an affair, and manages to turn it into something really quite interesting and quite profound in several ways as well, I think. Next up, from another indie, I read The Way the Day Breaks by David Roberts and published by Weatherclass Books. And this I found really compelling. I thought this was excellently done. The core idea of it is we're sort of told this mostly in two narratives. There's a sort of third section at the end, but the majority of the book is done as two separate narrative styles. The first is told entirely through dialogue. So no kind of he said, she said, completely done by line of dialogue, other line of dialogue, blah, blah, blah. And whereas that sounds like it'd be really confusing, I actually think it really allows the book to do something quite special, because it allows these sort of layered voices. It allows a very sharp ear to exactly how people talk. So, you know, sometimes sentences finish halfway through, sometimes things don't really make sense, or people repeat themselves, and all these kinds of things. And that's one side of the narrative. And the second is a sort of a separate part where the son, Michael, is recalling everything that happened, but told in the sentences of, I remember, blah, 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 I remember, blah, blah, blah. And what we start to unravel as the story is going on is exactly what is at the heart of this, which is that Michael is remembering a period of his life where his dad essentially was slowly having a breakdown, and sort of his mental health was descending quite rapidly. And so what we see is sort of at the beginning, his father is this sort of garrulous, friendly, fun type. He's a little bit off the wall, but it's in this sort of interesting, harmless way. And slowly we start to see how he has become obsessive about specific schemes or ideas. So he suddenly wants to sell everything and do something, or he wants to buy this thing and start a business, and he wants to do whatever. And these things start to mount up, and we slowly start to see the strain it's having on the family, where his wife is struggling with trying to balance that and look after the kids. We see how he starts to endanger the lives of people around him, and it just becomes this sort of increasingly profound and interesting thing. And I just thought it was really powerful the way that this book does it, because we have this dialogue. We're part of the narrative, listening in and kind of trying to decode things that are happening. We don't need to know exactly who's speaking. We can often pick it up. But what we do start to see is how the conversations become more and more frantic, and how the energy of those conversations becomes a little more charged with fear, and with tension, and all of these other things. And so it starts suddenly becoming this really in-depth narrative. And I just thought it was really excellently done. I thought this was a really profound book, really cleverly thought out. And I think that the form of this book really allowed that narrative to sing. It kind of, this sort of style of book really works for the kind of story it's trying to tell. So I thought it was really, really well done. Next up, I read The Pole and Other Short Stories by Coetzee. He is one of my favourite authors of all time. From pretty much everything I've read of his, I've really adored. I just think he's exceptional in his craft. And I thought this was an interesting selection of stories for several reasons. So firstly, The Pole is the main short story. It takes up about 150 pages of this 250-page book. It's sort of a novella in and of itself, really. And that tells the story of a Polish man who's a composer who falls in love with a woman who's supporting him in his sort of work. This is unrequited. She is confused by the fact that he loves her so much. Particularly this otherwise unassuming man has this fiery passion that he, sort of a really strong sense of feeling towards her, that she cannot really reciprocate, because she's sort of just like, well, what is this? But anyway, years later, it is revealed that he wrote poems that were about their love story. And she sort of tries to decode them and tries to understand the man, who he was. And I thought this was kind of Coetzee doing his very clever thing. There's a lot moving behind the scenes in that short story particularly. And then we come to the other short stories, and they are also incredibly interesting, particularly looking at memory. Memory is a big sort of recurring theme in this book. There's a lot of kind of moving away and then coming back to somewhere after many years and trying to understand it, which perhaps in some ways mirrors Coetzee's own life as someone who has moved from South Africa to Australia, and has sort of set up a new life there. Many of the characters in here are Australian, or sort of travel through Australia or have some kind of connection, including a character called Elizabeth Costello, which is the name of one of his previous books, which I've not read yet, but I really want to. And so I thought it was really interesting that there's this sort of nod to this character, which suggests, particularly as these short stories were written over several years, it wasn't all written just for this collection. Clearly, Elizabeth Costello is a character who is recurring in Coetzee's head, and there's something unresolved there. And so I thought it was quite interesting to see him write, a story that doesn't involve her, that's the main part of this collection, but pepper in little other stories. I think she's in 4 stories, I believe. And so I thought that was really quite interesting as well. I love Coetzee. I want to read more of his novels, including obviously Elizabeth Costello now because of this. But interesting to see him in a short story form. I've not read him doing short stories before, so it was really interesting. And last but not least, two non-fiction books that really impressed me in so many ways, and I think will probably end up in my sort of being some of the books I look back on and think about a lot this year. The first of which was Barbra Streisand's memoir. And I just thought this was such an interesting book in so many ways. I don't know actually that much about Barbra Streisand, as I was realizing from listening to the audiobook. Also would highly recommend the audiobook if you can get it, just because it is Barbara reading it herself, and she occasionally has these little moments of laughing to herself when she says something, so you sort of get her sort of saying, yeah, that did happen. What a guy. You're sort of like, I've not corroborated it, but I don't know how much of that is actually in the text itself, how many of these bits that she's ad-libbing and throwing in as she's sort of thinking back over this. But it's a book that she did a lot of research for. She's apparently been keeping notes and keeping records and doing research on for years, and really has been writing this as a labour of love for a very long time. And I think that's what really sets it apart, is it is so thorough. And for someone who doesn't know that much about her life, I was worried that would feel a bit plodding and a bit intense, because, there was a period where I was 20 something hours into the audiobook and we were still in the 60s. And I thought, hang on, they're going to be here a while. But there's something so interesting about the way it's never really name dropping. There's this sort of idea of this figure of who she is, at the heart of it, and she is incredibly modest about a lot of those things. So she sort of just talks about who she is and how she came to do that, and her sort of thoughts on it now, years later. So I thought it was a really well considered memoir. It felt like, yeah, it was a real labour of love and a real passion project for her. And particularly, she starts the book talking about how there have often been these stories about her being a diva and being hard to work with. And actually, this book suggests almost the entire opposite, that she's been an incredibly patient and willing participant, but also has not often been able to speak out very much because of being branded as such. So really, really interesting book in many, many ways. And finally, Naomi Klein's Doppelgangers. And this is a book I'd heard quite a few podcasts about and thought sounded really interesting. And I've read a couple of Naomi Klein's books before and really enjoyed them. So I was very excited for this. Essentially, the core premise behind this book is Naomi Klein, for a long time, has been confused online with another Naomi Wolf. And they're both writers. They both write about social issues. There are some other sort of demographic overlaps with them both. They often look quite similar. They both refer to their Jewishness in various articles and bits of writing that they do. And so and because obviously them both sharing a first name, it's quite easy for people to kind of accidentally mix them up. Now, this wasn't necessarily as much of a problem for Naomi Klein when she was sort of more junior in her career, and Naomi Wolf was this really big established writer. The problem then happened when Naomi Wolf sort of started veering in terms of her personal politics, or at least what she showed publicly, and a lot of her politics became really quite complicated. So, for example, Naomi Wolf at one point starts becoming sort of more of an anti-vaxxer. She starts becoming a lot more sort of enmeshed in some sort of far-right politics as well. She starts saying and doing these things that seem outrageous, but every time those things happen, Naomi Klein gets tagged on Twitter, and sort of people are sort of saying, oh wow, she's really gone and done something here. But what this book then does is takes that as a springboard to look really at this notion of doppelgangers. So not only the two Naomis being confused for each other, but also how do social media algorithms influence that? Because actually what often happens is that Twitter will see that the two names are being used commonly, and so will autofill or kind of suggest one for the other. It will also mean that, for example, it kind of just gets further and further enmeshed. Doppelgangers she then also looks at in terms of the mirror self. She looks at in terms of states, in terms of individuals, in terms of the ways that wings of politics will often ape each other's strategies to sort of destabilize that itself. So, for example, the far right taking the language and the language and tactics of the left and repurposing them. So, for example, one of the examples she gives is the term othering. So how far right groups start using the term, terms around being othered to talk about themselves and saying that they're being othered in a conversation about a certain topic or whatever. And so it's really fascinating because what she basically does is sort of really unpicks so many of the complex social issues that we're living through in many, many ways, sort of particularly political issues, and really looks at how this sort of these notions of doppelgangers and of misinformation permeate so many things, parts of that. So I just thought this was a really interesting book that is sort of, I think probably started as one thing, is sort of a desire to separate the Naomis in people's heads, and has sort of turned into a really deep and fascinating book. And I think something that I found really quite special here is Naomi Klein is obviously in many ways quite annoyed at a lot of what's happened, and particularly the ways that Naomi Wolf is using her platform. However, there's also a sort of an olive branch sort of suggested throughout this, where she really tries to also understand Naomi Wolf's position, and really tries to, by listening to podcasts, by listening to the kinds of media that Naomi Wolf is now surrounded in, and also trying to understand the sense of shame or kind of isolation that might have happened that maybe led her down some of these paths. So it's a really quite tender book, as well as being an incredibly passionate and angry one, and sort of not calculated, a very researched and thoughtful book as well. So I just found it really interesting in many, many ways. And those are the books that I have read this week. I hope you've enjoyed them. I'll see you again. There'll be other videos coming out, but the weekly reads will be a couple of weeks till the next one, or whenever it is. I hope you're doing really, really well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye. Have a great Christmas or New Year's or whatever in the meantime, until I see you next. Have a good one. Bye-bye.